Don't mind, I would like to wear this kind of like a badge of honor during the talk, if you all don't mind. So, I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Pandurang for, covering the blockchain with his insights. We really appreciated that talk. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Hemant Joshi for, kindly inviting us. We're really excited to talk to you guys about blockchain use cases. We're a young team, so we lack the experience that you all have, but we hope we're able to share some insights that, would be useful. To begin with, I'd like to ask the audience a survey. What is the main thing you'll look for when you're doing business in a community? The main thing you'll look for? Trust, exactly. Trust is a foundational aspect of business, right? Since 3500 BCE, when the Mesopotamians were being run by the Code of Hammurabi, it was always about how do we create trust amongst business communities. Yet, for some reason, trust and technology in the 21st century haven't really melded. There's not been a point of confluence until 2009. 2009 was when Satoshi Nakamoto invented the blockchain, and the blockchain is the trust machine. Now, there are some main characteristics which blockchain imparts to every use case, which I'd like to go through before my co-founders take over with deeper use cases. They are replicability. Now, replicability means that any endpoint in a blockchain system is completely replicable. So if you're to knock off one endpoint, it can easily be replicated by the others. Immutability. This means that once data is put on the blockchain, it is impossible to tamper with. Then it is very easy to share. Now what that means is if you were to put your data on the blockchain, you can determine that only certain people using public key cryptography can actually view your data. Lastly, this is easy audit trail, and I know I met a gentleman from NSDL, and this is a very good use case over there because you all provide an end-to-end audit trail. At least that used to be the case that we used to use email addresses. But if you're to map identities to the blockchain, which is a decentralized ledger, you can actually provide an end-to-end audit trail for proxy voting. Now to get into some use cases. I'm pretty sure everybody has heard of this one, right? Cryptocurrency. It is by far the most popular use case of the blockchain. In fact, cryptocurrency has exceeded $10 billion in market capitalization, 8 billion of which is in Bitcoin, which is the logo over there. Now, the fundamental problem that blockchain solves for cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is the double spend problem. What this means is tomorrow, let's say I'm a fraudster, and I was to have a Bitcoin and I was to do a transaction with you, how can you prevent me from spending it in multiple places and telling you it's authentic? The blockchain basically has this decentralized ledger which tracks a Bitcoin as though it was an entity. So every single public address that the Bitcoin has interacted with, the entire provenance is available at any given point of time. That means you can determine is a Bitcoin authentic or is it not. Now, of course, there are several other advantages like its low cost of acceptance and transfer, but those advantages mostly come from one big caveat, which is there's no regulation in Bitcoin. So if you look at the RBI statement, in December of 2013, they were a little cautious, what is Bitcoin? We don't know what to do with it. But in December 2015, exactly 2 years later, they're like, oh, it's a very positive thing, very revolutionary technology, let's have a look at it. So I think the future for this use case is extremely positive, and we're definitely looking forward to seeing what can happen in the space of cryptocurrency. I'd now like to call Sahil, who's my co-founder, and he will talk about another use case with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Raunaq, and hello and good afternoon. I'm Sahil, and the use case I'm going to be touching upon is interbank payments. Now, how many of you all have made interbank payments? Actually, that shouldn't be a question. I'm sure all of you all have. And you all are all aware of how frustrating it can get, especially when you're making international payments. Even more so when you're dealing with currencies other than the top 5 fiat currencies. Now, the problem really exists, and this is going to be a time-consuming and costly process, not just for us, but also for the banks involved, because there aren't just the 2 banks involved. There's a slew of intermediaries that need to do all of this reconciliation of silo data. And why does this happen is because the banks don't trust each other, at least not all banks. And they can't. You can't have banks in every country trusting every other bank. But what if we could bring this trust machine Raunaq spoke about into the picture, the blockchain, that creates this blockchain could create an infrastructure that lets all banks be nodes on this network and deal with each other without having to trust each other. Now, this could happen because every bank has a local copy of the data, which is always in sync, which means they're basically having a shared database. I could directly deal with the next bank. I don't need intermediaries, and we've gotten rid of reconciliation. Now, I'm sure I'm talking to a lot of CAs here, so you're aware of how troublesome bank reconciliation could be. Now, getting rid of that could be a boon. And this would make the entire process go so much faster, because stuff that involves intermediaries takes longer, and I could bring down stuff that takes a couple of days down to a couple of minutes. In fact, the NASDAQ is doing it even today experimentally with their equity platform. They're trying to bring this entire process to make it so much simpler that you could trade equities that today takes days. It takes a long time to get hold of your equity. This could happen within one day, in fact, in a couple of minutes. So I think I see the blockchain lending beautifully to this use case. Now, there are a couple more. There's one more which may be a different use case, but I see the blockchain fitting as beautifully in this. That's of a registry. And I'd actually like to call on Ariman to talk more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahil. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for having us here today. So the properties of blockchains that Raunaq, Pandurang, and Sahil talked about earlier, immutability, permission sharing of data, replicability, all these properties lend themselves very well to a registry. So currently, first I'll talk about something we built at Elemental. So recently, a couple of weeks ago, we built a proof of concept for a blockchain-powered Know Your Customer KYC registry for the National Stock Exchange of India. Under the categories that Pandurang spoke about, I guess it would be a smart contract platform that uses Byzantine fault tolerance. But basically, we created a database which has sensitive information in it, which is people's financial data. And we created a system which allows banks and people partner with the NSE to make requests for that data. Every time a request is made for data, the person requesting it is authorized, and if they have permission, the data goes out. What data goes out, when it goes out, who it goes out to, this is all recorded in an immutable ledger. There's easy kind of accounting for who asked for what data when. There's auditing, and obviously the data itself can't be tampered with or changed unless it's by somebody with the requisite permissions. So that's something we built out a couple of weeks ago, and we're continuing to kind of build on it. And on a wider scale, Sweden, the government of Sweden actually trialed a blockchain-based land registry for all property deeds and titles. So they did a trial of this in June of this year, and that trial was apparently highly successful. So in a couple of months this fall, they're hoping to launch this system in production. So it'll be the world's first blockchain-powered land registry. So all land titles in Sweden, who owns them, kind of, how big is the land, all that information, a digital document will be put on a blockchain. So buyers, sellers, landowners, investors, government, regulators, they all have access to this kind of ledger to see, okay, who owns what. And that'll also open up kind of very fast settling and clearing of land trades and land deals. So going forward, I think we'll see a lot of blockchain-powered registries. Hopefully, we can have some here in India that kind of help people and help government. So that's blockchain-powered registries. And now I'd like Anil to kind of come and talk about trade finance, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, like my friends here spoke, blockchain has some impeccable properties that let us solve real-world problems without a lot of hassle. So let's talk about an implementation of one of the business processes called as trade financing on the blockchain. And let's try doing this using something called smart contracts. At a very base level, smart contracts are building blocks of distributed and decentralized applications. You read, write, access data, share data, and perform actions through smart contracts. Every user in the system has an address and a couple of keys. The keys let you prove ownership of the address being the identity. You can now call these smart contracts to perform actions. So in trade financing, we have three parties. We have a buyer, a seller, and a financer. Now, the seller needs money instantly, but the buyer has a standoff period of 30 days. So now he approaches the financer, and financer has to settle the payments for a fee. But this process usually takes very long. And the simple reason for that is since invoices are being displayed, there's always a possibility of invoices being reused. It could be fraud or error, but this is a huge concern. So if we were to take the smart contract approach to solve this problem, first of all, the smart contract governs data and logic in the same place. which means when the seller puts the invoice on the blockchain, he has to sign it to prove authenticity that he owns the invoice. And once this is done, he cannot reissue the same invoice on the blockchain because it's immutable data. At this point, the buyer signs off on the invoice with his private key, which means now we know both the buyer and seller have agreed on the invoice, which makes it all the more easier for financer to start financing. At this point, the smart contract will open up access to this invoice to all the financiers available. As and when bids come in, the seller will accept a bid from a given financer. At this point in time, the smart contract will seal the deal and shut the invoice from access. It will make sure that settlements happen, and it will keep track of the same. Once this is done, this invoice is now destroyed from access to financiers. So now if he tried to reissue it again, it wouldn't work. Also, the buyer wouldn't sign off on it again. So this lets us solve this whole problem without an intermediary involved in the process, and also make it fast and reliable. We can audit trail the whole process. So that being said, blockchain is incredible technology, has a lot of use cases, and we're open to working with a lot more. And yeah, I think we're open for questions now.
My name is Sheshu. I'm one of the sponsors, by the way, of this from Retheme Technologies. One question, I mean, Raunaq or whoever. What is the, I mean, from whatever, I mean, this is the first time I'm really getting into blockchains and Bitcoin this in a way. But is it very different from a centralized database? Or is it a centralized database that is shared between different people and where there is trust built into that centralized database? I mean, like a visa system or something of that kind. Is it, analogy would be that?
Yeah, sure. So Anil, I think you can go over the central database differences.
Yeah, sure enough. So yeah, this is very similar to what you just said, as in blockchain is a data store, and it is a distributed data store, but more importantly, it's a decentralized data store, which okay, so what that implies is that even though it's distributed, which normal database can be as well, it's decentralized and holds the entire data with itself. At this point of time, if there are failures in certain nodes, you can still revive those nodes and get the data back. At the same time, this consensus is maintained at every instance. So chances for fraud falls down really low.
Yeah, and would there be a requirement of a centralized structure to manage this or something between parties?
Yes and no. That depends on the given use case. But to answer your question, you do not need a central governance while you're running a distributed blockchain. The whole ecosystem can run off based on mutual consensus.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Anyway, introduction. I mean, good to hear something. I mean, I learned something new today. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just about to say, actually, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I think the one essential difference with a shared database here would be that, in a shared database, even if you take a Cassandra or a Mongo DB and just, replicate it and shard it and all that, you always have this notion of an admin who can, go in and change things and not leave a trail, which is a fundamental thing you can't do here. One is, in either not be able to make a change, and if you do, you can't hide that trail. So I think that I would highlight as a essential difference with a shared database.
Yeah. Now, today, if I try to transfer some amount from one bank to another bank, I'm able to transfer it with reasonably good, within a minute's time a transaction is completed, and it's pretty secure. Then how does this differ? What are the value addition from this proposed solution?
Sure. So actually, we were working with Barclays in between to explore this whole, concept of international payments. And one big issue, especially if you're not dealing in the top 5 fiat currencies, as Sahil mentioned, is there's this system of corresponding banks. Now, corresponding banks, there are always 2 sets of them, right? There's the sending corresponding bank and the receiving corresponding bank. So, for example, if I use HDFC Bank to send money to Kenya and Kenyan shillings, their chances are HDFC isn't directly being able to transfer this, even the fact that they've transferred this money. So the fact that there's so many silos of data which need to be reconciled leads to a lot of time. And as Sahil mentioned, it's expensive not only for the consumer, but for the bank. So they're barely making any margins on it. Okay. So while it is settled, it's not really settled in the back end.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, one more thing
Sir.
I'd like to add here is a very good point. I don't know who made it from the team, but good point. So the other angle here is, in terms of for the banks themselves, in addition to the benefit of a consumer, banks themselves in a system that uses blockchain could increase their liquidity by having to maintain lower collateral when dealing with several multinational correspondent banks. So today, if I'm bank in India dealing with, let's say, 25 different foreign banks having bilateral agreements, I have to maintain, collateral with intermediaries or in my correspondent account that would meet my needs across these 50 different things. So it could be collateral held in 50 different currencies and different amount. Now, if you build a system that works on top of a blockchain, and we've kind of used something called Ripple to do a demonstration on how you could do this, you can significantly reduce that collateral by maintaining a common virtual represent currency equivalent of what you need to maintain, thereby offering you more liquidity in your business. So there is benefit to be explored both for consumers and for the banks themselves in this particular market.
Just one question. Technologically, it is very advanced and it will give benefit that is understood. How many countries in the world has legitimized this transaction? Because already one use cases for the what you refer that registry case, the using blockchain from registry. So in going forward, do you think that their International Monetary Fund or any central banking thing will come up with some legislation to get this thing more trust building to legitimize this transaction in the end user level or business to business level?
Sure. Regulators are definitely recognizing that they have to make something of it and legitimize it and regulate it, and they can't ignore it anymore. However, it's still a challenge. Many of the countries, many of the big names, including India, China, or US for that matter, have started looking at it. However, the views are divergent and changing. Somebody from Raunaq's team talked about how RBI changed its view over the 2 years. So in US, for example, the judiciary, the IRS, and the government have three distinct views on whether Bitcoin, for example, is a property, it's an asset, or it's a currency, right? So those views are converging through dialogue and so forth. But meanwhile, acceptance of some of these cryptocurrencies in day-to-day commerce, in legitimate commerce, has been growing. And several stores and vendors now accept Bitcoin or other alternative currencies. So that has started gaining traction. Is it ready for prime time yet? I'm not quite sure we are there yet, but we'll be getting there fairly shortly.
I have a broader question. We as IS auditors, what skills we need to have to be able to audit businesses, IT infrastructures who are embracing blockchain technologies? Any views? Because we have to figure out that, but
In fact, no, I think it's going to be simpler and more easier now to audit, because now you can look at the blockchain like a time machine now. I could actually look at the state of the system at any time. I could just go back, move the block height. Yeah. The block height acts as a timestamp. So now I could decide to go back to block height, which was a week ago, and now any query I make will give me returns as if this is a week ago. I could see the data as it was. None of the data gets lost. So I think this, in fact, should be an auditor's dream. No loss of data.
so let us start a startup company to train auditors.
So just to go back to the earlier question about regulation and kind of how blockchain or Bitcoin will be regulated going forward, I think as we kind of, Pandurang rightly mentioned, there should be a split in how we think about it. Like Bitcoin is one application of blockchain technology, and it's a very kind of Bitcoin is one thing, and then blockchain is kind of a whole general other category. How Bitcoin will play out in the future is anybody's guess. It's uncertain. It's a completely new kind of invention. It's a cryptographically secured new currency, and how it's going to kind of mesh with our current world economic order and monetary system is unclear. Nobody knows how that's going to happen. China and Russia are the only two governments that right now have a bit of a cold view on it, but everywhere else, I mean, different levels of regulation about Bitcoin specifically. On blockchain, I think you'll hear all kinds of corporates and governments all around the world making very encouraging sounds and noises about it. So the government of England, including the Bank of England, is very bullish on blockchain technology, and they're aggressively exploring how blockchain technology could be used in a variety of places within the public sector, including within kind of internal accounting processes. Similarly, the US Post Office thinks that the blockchain could be really kind of big for them. So I would say blockchain technology, it's very vast, it's very kind of broad, it's a very big category. So in that regard, definitely a lot of countries want to encourage innovation and see how they can help each other and themselves with the tech.
My question is a very fundamental question, nothing to do with blockchain as a technology, but more specifically with cryptocurrency and what people can relate to Bitcoin probably. A general principle associated with finance and monetary policy is that currency that is issued by a central bank to a large extent represents the value of a country. You know, it is backed by the value in a country, the reserves, whatever it stands for. Today, Bitcoin, there was a lot of controversy with respect to what Bitcoin stands for, and the answer that was largely given was that the value of the Bitcoin represents nothing, but it's determined by the demand-supply equation in the market. So has this debate been settled yet, or still we are debating as to what